Welcome, traveller of time, to tonight's gentle descent into the quiet corners of history. Whether you're resting after a long day or simply seeking a moment of calm, I'm grateful to have you here. Do let me know where you're listening from and what hour it is for you. I imagine us as glowing dots on a spinning globe, connected by curiosity and the hush of night. And if this peaceful storytelling brings a little stillness to your day, feel free to subscribe. We'll have many more historical tales to share. Deep within the temple complexes of ancient Egypt, where golden sunlight filtered through massive stone columns, lived women who served as more than mere priestesses. These were the sacred dancers of Hathor, the goddess of love, music, and joy. Their bodies moved in perfect harmony with celestial rhythms, their voices lifted in songs that could transport mortals into the presence of the divine. But this wasn't just entertainment or simple worship. This was a sophisticated spiritual practice that connected the earthly realm with the divine through the most human of experiences: pleasure, movement, and sacred intimacy. Tonight, I'm going to take you on a journey back over 3,000 years to witness the untold story of these remarkable women. You'll discover how they transformed temple courtyards into stages for divine drama, how their dances could heal the sick and ensure the fertility of the Nile, and why their practices were considered so powerful that they influenced the very fate of pharaohs. But more importantly, you'll meet the real people behind these ancient rituals. Women like Nefertiti, whose story was carved into temple walls, and Amanirdis, whose personal letters reveal intimate details of temple life that archaeologists are still deciphering today. What you're about to learn will completely transform your understanding of ancient Egyptian spirituality, because the dancing priestesses of Hathor weren't just performers. They were gatekeepers to mysteries that connected human sexuality with divine power in ways that modern religions have almost entirely forgotten. Let me start by dropping you into a scene that unfolded over 3,000 years ago in the Temple of Dendera. The morning mist still clung to the Nile's surface when Kentika walked barefoot across the cool stone floors toward the inner sanctum. Her linen dress, so fine it was nearly transparent, caught the early light streaming through the temple's clerestory windows. Today was different. Today, she would perform the sacred dance of awakening for the goddess Hathor, a ritual that could determine whether the annual flood would bring prosperity or famine to all of Egypt. But Kentika wasn't nervous. She had trained for this moment since childhood, learning not just the intricate steps and gestures, but the deeper mysteries behind each movement. Every sway of her hips corresponded to the phases of the moon. Every arch of her back mirrored the curve of the sky goddess Nut. When she danced, she didn't just honor Hathor, she became Hathor, channeling the goddess's power through her mortal form. This is where our story truly begins, because understanding the dancing priestesses of Hathor requires us to completely reimagine what we think we know about ancient Egyptian religion. These weren't somber, austere practices conducted by celibate priests in dark temples. Instead, they were vibrant celebrations of life, fertility, and divine joy that filled sacred spaces with music, laughter, and yes, sensual pleasure. The goddess Hathor herself embodied this complex relationship between the sacred and the sensual. Known as the Golden One, she was simultaneously the nurturing mother who suckled the pharaoh, the fierce lioness who could destroy Egypt's enemies, and the seductive lover who awakened desire in both gods and mortals. Her temples weren't just places of worship. They were centers of healing, education, and spiritual transformation, where music and dance served as pathways to divine consciousness. Imagine walking through the great temple complex at Dendera during the height of the New Kingdom. The air would be thick with the scent of frankincense and myrrh, but also with the more earthly aromas of lotus blossoms and sweet oils that adorned the dancers' bodies. The sound of sistrums, those sacred rattles, that mimicked the rustling of papyrus in the wind, would create a constant rhythmic backdrop punctuated by the deeper notes of drums and the haunting melodies of flutes. But it was the dancers themselves who truly brought these spaces to life. These women came from all levels of Egyptian society. Some were daughters of nobles who dedicated their lives to temple service. Others were born into priestly families and raised from infancy in the sacred arts. Still others were chosen for their exceptional beauty or talent and brought to the temples as young girls to begin their training. Take Henut Tawi, whose story we know from papyrus documents discovered in the Theban tombs. Born to a family of musicians in Memphis, she showed an extraordinary gift for dance from an early age. Her movements seemed to flow like water, and when she danced, even the temple cats would stop their prowling to watch. By the age of 12, she had been selected to join the prestigious sisterhood of Hathor at Karnak, where she would spend the next 15 years mastering the most sacred and secret rituals of the goddess. The training these young women underwent was far more comprehensive than we might imagine. Yes, they learned to dance with a grace and precision that could captivate audiences of thousands during public festivals. But they also studied astronomy, learning to read the movements of stars and planets so their performances could align with cosmic rhythms. They memorized vast collections of hymns and sacred texts, many of which contained esoteric knowledge about the nature of divine consciousness and the hidden forces that governed the universe. Most importantly, they learned to use their bodies as instruments of spiritual power. This wasn't about seduction in any crude sense, though their movements were undeniably sensual. Instead, it was about understanding how physical beauty, graceful movement, and rhythmic sound could open doorways between the mortal and divine realms. When a skilled priestess of Hathor performed the dance of the 7 veils, she wasn't simply removing clothing. She was symbolically stripping away the layers of illusion that separated human consciousness from divine awareness. The daily life of these sacred dancers was structured around cycles that mirrored the natural rhythms of Egypt itself. They rose before dawn to perform the morning rituals that welcomed the sun god Ra on his daily journey across the sky. Their movements during these ceremonies were slow and meditative, designed to harmonize their energy with the growing light. As the sun reached its zenith, their dances became more vigorous and joyful, celebrating the full power of divine radiance. But it was during the evening rituals that their most mysterious and powerful ceremonies took place. As darkness fell and the temple courtyards filled with flickering torchlight, the priestesses would perform the dances of transformation. These were the rituals that ordinary Egyptians rarely witnessed, ceremonies that dealt with the deeper mysteries of death and rebirth, of sexual energy as a force of cosmic creation, and of the thin boundaries between pleasure and spiritual ecstasy. Nefertiti left us one of the most detailed accounts of what these evening ceremonies involved. In hieroglyphic inscriptions that cover an entire wall of her tomb near Saqqara, she describes how the priestesses would begin by purifying themselves in sacred pools filled with water from the Nile mix and jasmine. They would then add with oils of lotus adorn their bodies with jewelry that had rituals, pieces been blessed in elaborate that weren't merely decorative, but served as spiritual tools designed to channel and focus divine energy. The dances themselves followed patterns that had been preserved unchanged for centuries, movements that told the stories of creation, of the annual flooding of the Nile, and of the eternal cycle of death and resurrection that governed all life in Egypt. But within these traditional forms, each priestess was expected to bring her own interpretation, her own connection to the divine mysteries she was embodying. When Nefertiti describes performing the dance of the awakening lotus, her words convey both the technical precision required and the profound spiritual experience it created. She speaks of feeling her consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of her physical form, of sensing the presence of Hathor flowing through her movements, and of achieving moments of perfect unity between her individual will and the cosmic forces that sustained all existence. These weren't isolated experiences limited to a few exceptionally gifted individuals. The entire structure of temple life was designed to cultivate and support these states of consciousness. The priestesses lived in communities where every aspect of daily existence was oriented towards spiritual development. They ate foods that were believed to enhance their sensitivity to divine influences. They slept in chambers where the acoustics had been carefully designed to amplify the subtle sounds of their breathing and heartbeat, creating natural rhythms that could induce trance states. Most importantly, they were part of a sisterhood that provided both practical support and spiritual guidance. Older priestesses served as mentors, passing down not just the technical aspects of their craft, but also the wisdom needed to navigate the intense psychological and spiritual experiences that advanced practice could generate. These relationships often lasted for decades, creating bonds of loyalty and love that transcended the normal social hierarchies of Egyptian society. The influence of these dancing priestesses extended far beyond the temple walls. Pharaohs regularly consulted them before making major decisions, believing that their connection to Hathor gave them access to divine wisdom about the future. Queens and noble women sought their services for healing rituals, fertility ceremonies, and guidance in matters of love and marriage, and even foreign dignitaries visiting Egypt would request private performances, recognizing that witnessing the sacred dances was essential to understanding the true source of Egyptian power and prosperity. But perhaps most significantly, the priestesses of Hathor served as guardians of knowledge that connected sexuality with spirituality in ways that most ancient cultures kept strictly separate. They understood that the same energy that created physical pleasure could, when properly directed, generate profound spiritual insights and healing powers. This wasn't about using sexuality for purely personal gratification, but about recognizing erotic energy as one of the fundamental forces that connected individual consciousness with the creative power of the universe itself. The ceremonies they conducted for married couples were particularly remarkable. These weren't simply fertility rituals, though ensuring conception was often one of their goals. Instead, they were comprehensive teachings about how physical intimacy could become a form of worship, how the act of love between husband and wife could mirror and participate in the cosmic union between divine masculine and feminine principles that Egyptian cosmology saw as the source of all creation. These sacred marriage ceremonies typically took place during the festival seasons when the boundaries between the mortal and divine worlds were considered most permeable. Couples would come to the temple not just seeking the goddess's blessing on their union, but requesting initiation into mysteries that could transform their relationship into something far more profound than mere companionship or physical attraction. Amanirdis, whose personal letters were discovered sealed in clay jars beneath the temple at Edfu, provides us with intimate details of how these ceremonies unfolded. Writing to her sister who served at a temple in Upper Egypt, she describes guiding a young couple through the ritual known as the sacred marriage of heaven and earth. The ceremony began at sunset, when the dying light symbolized the temporary death that precedes all rebirth and transformation. The couple would first undergo separate purification rituals. The man was led by male priests through ceremonies that connected him with the solar aspects of divine masculinity, while the woman was guided by the dancing priestesses through rites that awakened her identification with the lunar feminine. But these weren't gender stereotypes in any modern sense. Instead, they represented complementary cosmic principles that every human being contained, regardless of their physical form. Amanirdis writes about how she would teach the woman to move in ways that honored both her own desires and the divine forces flowing through her body. Every gesture became a prayer, every breath a communion with Hathor's presence. The man, meanwhile, learned to see his beloved not just as an individual person, but as a living embodiment of the goddess herself, worthy of the same reverence he would show to any sacred image in the temple. When the couple finally came together in the inner chamber, their union became something far more than personal pleasure or even procreation. According to Amanirdis, It became a reenactment of the primordial moment when the creator god Atum first divided himself into male and female principles, setting in motion the cosmic dance that would eventually birth the entire universe. But the priestesses of Hathor didn't limit their teachings to married couples. They also served as healers and counselors for women facing challenges that other religious practitioners couldn't address. Women struggling with infertility, those recovering from difficult childbirths, and even those dealing with what we might now recognize as depression or anxiety would seek out the dancing priestesses for treatments that combined physical therapy with spiritual healing. Khenti Min, whose story is preserved in medical papyri from the 18th dynasty, specialized in treating women who had lost their capacity for joy. These weren't necessarily cases of clinical depression, but rather spiritual conditions where the natural flow of life energy had become blocked or misdirected. Her treatments involved teaching these women specific dance movements designed to reopen the channels through which divine pleasure and vitality could flow. The process could take months or even years. Khenti Min would begin by having her patients simply observe the temple dances, allowing their bodies to gradually remember rhythms they had forgotten. Slowly, she would introduce them to basic movements, teaching them to reconnect with the natural grace that existed within every human form. As their confidence grew, she would guide them into more complex choreographies that told stories of healing, renewal, and spiritual awakening. But perhaps most remarkably, Khenti Min understood that true healing required addressing not just individual symptoms, but the social and cultural conditions that had created the problem in the first place. Many of the women who came to her had been taught to suppress their natural sensuality, to view their bodies as sources of shame rather than vessels of divine power. Her treatments involved not just personal healing, but a kind of social revolution that challenged the assumptions about femininity that pervaded even ancient Egyptian society. The festivals dedicated to Hathor provided the most dramatic displays of what the dancing priestesses could accomplish when they worked together as a unified community. The most famous of these was the Festival of Drunkenness, held annually at Dendera during the season when the Nile's floods began to recede. The name might suggest mere celebration, but the reality was far more sophisticated. The festival lasted for 7 days and nights, during which the normal social order of Egyptian society was temporarily suspended. Peasants could dance alongside nobles, slaves could participate as equals with their masters, and the rigid hierarchies that usually governed daily life gave way to a communal experience of divine joy and liberation. The priestesses of Hathor served as guides and guardians of this transformation, ensuring that the temporary chaos remained constructive rather than destructive. Hanut Neferet, who served as chief priestess at Dendera during the reign of Rameses II, left detailed instructions for conducting the festival that reveal the careful planning required to create experiences of authentic spiritual ecstasy. The dancing began slowly, with simple movements that allowed participants to shed their everyday identities and connect with deeper rhythms. Gradually, the complexity increased, drawing dancers into states of consciousness, where individual boundaries dissolved and the entire crowd began moving as a single, unified organism. The climax came on the 4th night, when the priestesses performed the dance of the eternal return. This was a choreography so complex and demanding that only the most experienced practitioners could execute it properly. The dance told the story of Hathor's journey to Nubia and her eventual return to Egypt, but on a deeper level, it represented the cyclical nature of all existence, the eternal rhythm of separation and reunion that governed everything from the movement of celestial bodies to the beating of human hearts. Foreign visitors who witnessed these festivals often struggled to describe what they had experienced. A Syrian merchant, whose account survives on a damaged papyrus fragment, writes about feeling as though he had been transported into the presence of the gods themselves. A Greek philosopher visiting during the Ptolemaic period describes the dances as revealing truths about the nature of reality that years of rational study had failed to uncover. But for the priestesses themselves, these public festivals represented only the most visible aspect of their work. The real mysteries took place in private ceremonies that few outsiders ever witnessed. These involved practices so powerful and potentially dangerous that they were surrounded by elaborate safeguards and conducted only by priestesses who had demonstrated exceptional stability and wisdom. Nefertiti Kais describes one such ceremony in cryptic language that has taken modern scholars decades to decode. Known as the opening of the way, it involved a form of trance dancing that could induce experiences of consciousness, leaving the physical body and traveling to other realms of existence. The priestess performing this dance would enter a state so deep that she appeared to be unconscious, yet her body would continue moving in perfect rhythm, guided by forces that seemed to come from beyond her individual will. These out-of-body experiences weren't considered mere hallucinations or psychological phenomena. Instead, they were understood as genuine journeys into the divine realm, where the dancing priestess could commune directly with Hathor and other deities, receiving guidance about everything from medical treatments to political decisions. The information obtained during these journeys was carefully recorded and formed part of the temple's most sacred archives. The risks involved in such practices were significant. Some priestesses never successfully returned from their spiritual journeys, remaining in permanent trance states that resembled catatonia. Others returned with their personalities fundamentally altered, as though essential aspects of their human identity had been left behind in the divine realm. The temple communities developed elaborate support systems to help practitioners navigate these dangers while still preserving access to the extraordinary knowledge and power that the practices could provide. Training for the most advanced ceremonies began in childhood and continued throughout a priestess's entire career. Young girls selected for this path underwent years of preparation that included not just dance instruction, but intensive study of astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and psychology. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when someone was ready for deeper initiation, and how to guide others through spiritual crises that might arise during intense practice. The relationship between teacher and student in these traditions was unlike anything found in other ancient educational systems. It wasn't based primarily on the transmission of intellectual information, but on a kind of energetic attunement that allowed the student to gradually absorb and embody the teacher's level of consciousness. This process could take decades and created bonds of intimacy and mutual dependence that transcended ordinary human relationships. The most advanced practitioners of these arts could achieve states that modern science struggles to explain. Merit Naith, whose tomb inscription describes her as she who dances between worlds, apparently possessed the ability to heal serious illnesses through dance alone. Witnesses describe how she would enter a trance state so profound that her movements seemed to create visible energy fields around sick patients. Those who experienced her healing dances reported not just physical recovery, but profound psychological transformations that lasted for years. One particularly well-documented case involves a nobleman named Amenemheb, who suffered from what ancient texts describe as the sickness that steals joy. Modern physicians might recognize this as severe depression, but Egyptian healers understood it as a spiritual condition where the person's K or life force had become disconnected from divine sources of vitality. Traditional treatments had failed completely, and Amenemheb had reached a point where he could barely function in daily life. When he was brought to Merit Naith's temple, she spent 3 days simply observing him, studying the subtle patterns of his breathing, his posture, and the way he moved through space. Then she began what dance she called the of remembering. For 7 consecutive nights, she danced around his motionless form, her movements telling the story of his soul's journey from birth through his current crisis and into potential healing. Amenemheb later described the experience as watching his entire life unfold before him. but from a perspective that revealed hidden meanings and connections he had never recognized. By the fourth night, he began moving involuntarily, his body responding to rhythms that seemed to emerge from deep within his cellular memory. By the seventh night, he was dancing alongside Merit Naith, tears streaming down his face as decades of suppressed emotion finally found expression through movement. The transformation was so complete that Amenemheb dedicated the remaining years of his life to supporting the temple, becoming one of its most generous benefactors. But more importantly for our understanding of these practices, he left detailed written accounts of how the experience had changed not just his emotional state, but his entire perception of reality. He describes feeling reconnected to sources of meaning and purpose that he had forgotten existed, as though the dance had literally rewoven the fabric of his consciousness. Stories like this weren't considered miraculous or supernatural by ancient Egyptians. Instead, they represented the natural outcome of practices that had been refined over countless generations. The dancing priestesses understood human consciousness as something far more fluid than Wed and Maul typically imagined today. They knew techniques for accessing states of awareness that could facilitate healing, generate prophetic visions, and create experiences of unity with cosmic forces that govern the universe. The temple at Komombo preserves some of the most detailed practices. Carved instructions for these advanced into walls that most visitors never see. These hieroglyphic texts describe specific movements designed to activate what the Egyptians called the serpent fire that lay dormant at the base of the spine. When properly awakened through dance, this energy would rise through the body's energy centers, ultimately reaching the crown of the head, where it would create a direct connection with divine consciousness. The process was neither simple nor safe. Inscriptions warn about practitioners who attempted to force this awakening before they were properly prepared, resulting in psychological instability or even physical injury. The texts describe elaborate preparation rituals that could take months to complete, involving dietary restrictions, purification ceremonies, and intensive meditation practices that gradually prepared the body and mind for the profound, energetic shifts involved. Ankh Esen Amun, whose name means she lives for Amun, left the most complete account of successfully completing this advanced training. Her personal papyrus, discovered in a sealed chamber beneath the Luxor temple, describes the entire process in language that reads like poetry, but contains precise technical instructions for those who know how to interpret the symbolic references. She writes about learning to feel the subtle energy currents that flow through the human body, discovering how specific dance movements could redirect these currents to create healing or spiritual awakening. She describes achieving states of consciousness where her individual identity seemed to dissolve completely, leaving only pure awareness moving in perfect harmony with cosmic rhythms. Most remarkably, she claims to have learned how to induce similar states in others simply through the power of her presence and movement. The political implications of possessing such abilities were enormous. Pharaohs regularly consulted the most accomplished priestesses before making major decisions, believing that their expanded consciousness could provide access to divine wisdom about future events. The priestess Taweret Nefret, who served during the troubled period between the Old and Middle Kingdoms, apparently predicted the rise of the Middle Kingdom pharaohs decades before it occurred. Information that helped certain noble families position themselves advantageously during the transition. But the priestesses were careful to maintain their independence from political authority. They served the gods first and human rulers second, a distinction that sometimes created tension with pharaohs who wanted to use their abilities for purely political purposes. The temple archives contain several examples of priestesses who refused royal commands that conflicted with their religious duties, sometimes at considerable personal cost. The training systems that produced such remarkable individuals were themselves marvels of ancient pedagogy. Young girls selected for advanced training didn't simply learn dance steps and ritual procedures. Instead, they underwent comprehensive education that included astronomy, mathematics, anatomy, psychology, and what we might now call consciousness studies. They learned to read the subtle signs that revealed a person's emotional and spiritual state, to recognize the energetic patterns that preceded illness, and to understand how different types of music and movement could influence human consciousness. The curriculum also included extensive study of what the Egyptians called the hidden teachings, esoteric knowledge about the nature of reality that was considered too powerful for general circulation. These teachings dealt with subjects like the relationship between consciousness and matter, the hidden forces that connected all living beings, and techniques for accessing information from non-ordinary states of consciousness. Hanut-Wedjebu, who served as a master teacher at the Temple of Kom Ombo during the New Kingdom, developed what may have been the ancient world's most sophisticated system for training consciousness. Her methods involved teaching students to achieve precise control over their attention, learning to focus awareness so completely on specific objects or ideas that ordinary mental chatter would cease entirely. From this foundation of mental stillness, students could then learn to access subtler levels of perception that revealed information invisible to normal consciousness. The process typically began with simple exercises in sustained attention. Students would be asked to focus on a single point of light for extended periods, gradually building their capacity to maintain unwavering concentration. As their mental discipline developed, they would progress to more complex practices involving visualization, where they would learn to create detailed mental images and maintain them with perfect clarity for hours at a time. The most advanced students learned what Hanut-Wedjebu called the art of conscious dreaming, the ability to maintain full awareness while entering dreamlike states that provided access to normally unconscious knowledge. Masters of this technique could apparently receive detailed information about distant events, communicate with deceased individuals, and even explore what they described as alternative versions of reality that existed parallel to ordinary experience. These abilities weren't considered supernatural gifts available only to specially chosen individuals. Instead, they were understood as natural human capacities that could be developed through proper training and practice. The dancing priestesses saw themselves as teachers and guides, helping others discover potentials that already existed within their own consciousness. The healing work conducted by these priestesses extended far beyond individual therapy sessions. They understood illness as fundamentally connected to social and environmental conditions, recognizing that individual health was inseparable from the health of the entire community. This perspective led them to develop interventions that addressed not just personal symptoms, but the cultural patterns that created those symptoms in the first place. During periods of social upheaval, such as the chaos that followed the collapse of the Old Kingdom, the priestesses of Hathor served as stabilizing forces that helped communities maintain their psychological and spiritual equilibrium. They would organize large-scale healing ceremonies that brought together hundreds or even thousands of participants, creating collective experiences of renewal and hope that could sustain entire regions through difficult transitions. These mass ceremonies followed carefully choreographed patterns that had been refined over centuries of practice. The priestesses understood how to use music, movement, and group dynamics to create states of consciousness that transcended individual limitations and connected participants with sources of strength and wisdom that existed beyond personal experience. People who participated in these events often described feeling part of something much larger than themselves, as though they had temporarily merged with the eternal rhythms that sustained all life. The Festival of Hathor at Philae provides one of the best documented examples of how these large-scale ceremonies functioned. Held annually during the season of low Nile waters, when communities throughout Egypt faced their greatest challenges, the festival drew participants from across the ancient world. For 10 days and nights, the island temple complex became a center of continuous celebration that combined religious worship with healing practices and community renewal. The priestesses who orchestrated this event possessed organizational skills that rivaled those of modern event planners, but they also understood how to create experiences that touched the deepest levels of human consciousness. They knew exactly when to introduce different types of music, when to shift meditative movements to vig from slower celebration, and how to guide thousands of participants through collective experiences of transcendence without losing control of the overall event. Foreign visitors often struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. A Roman administrator whose report survives in fragmentary papyri describes the festival as seeming to transform ordinary people into living gods, their faces radiant with joy and their movements flowing with supernatural grace. He admits that his rational mind could find no adequate explanation for the transformations he observed, though he notes that participants often displayed remarkable improvements in physical health and emotional well-being that lasted for months after the festival ended. The economic impact of these festivals was substantial, but the priestesses understood that their primary value lay in maintaining the spiritual and psychological health of Egyptian civilization. They saw themselves as guardians of knowledge and practices that kept society connected to sources of meaning and vitality that transcended material concerns. Without these periodic renewals, they believed, even the most prosperous civilization would eventually collapse from spiritual exhaustion and despair. This understanding led them to develop sophisticated theories about the relationship between individual consciousness and collective social health. They recognized that personal healing and social transformation were fundamentally interconnected processes, that you couldn't address one without dealing with the other. Their practices were designed to create individuals who could serve as agents of positive change within their communities, people whose expanded consciousness would naturally influence others toward greater health and wholeness. The training programs that produced such individuals required enormous investments of time and resources. A young woman entering advanced priestly training could expect to spend 15 to 20 years mastering the various arts and sciences required for full initiation. During this period, she would be supported entirely by the temple community, receiving not just instruction, but comprehensive care that included medical treatment, psychological counseling, and spiritual guidance. The selection process for these programs was remarkably sophisticated, involving assessments that evaluated not just talent and intelligence, but psychological stability, ethical character, and what the Egyptians called spiritual receptivity, the capacity to access expanded states of consciousness without losing connection to ordinary reality. Candidates underwent extensive testing that could last for months, designed to reveal hidden psychological weaknesses that might create problems during intensive training. Those who successfully completed the full program emerged as remarkable individuals who combined profound spiritual development with practical skills that made them valuable contributors to their communities. They could serve as healers, counselors, teachers, and advisors, but they could also function as leaders in times of crisis, people whose expanded perspective and emotional stability allowed them to guide others through challenges that might otherwise prove overwhelming. The influence of these priestesses extended throughout Egyptian society in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. They served as informal counselors to queens and noble women, providing guidance on everything from child rearing to political strategy. They trained the temple musicians and artists whose work shaped Egyptian culture for millennia. Most importantly, they preserved and transmitted knowledge about human consciousness and spiritual development that would otherwise have been lost to history. The preservation of this ancient knowledge wasn't left to chance. The dancing priestesses of Hathor developed elaborate systems for recording and transmitting their most sacred teachings, using methods that went far beyond simple written texts. They understood that the deepest mysteries of consciousness and spiritual practice couldn't be adequately conveyed through words alone, requiring instead a combination of direct experience, symbolic representation, and carefully structured initiation processes. Nefret Irie, who served as head archivist at the Great Temple of Dendera during the reign of Thutmose III, created what may have been the ancient world's most sophisticated system for preserving esoteric knowledge. she developed a form of hieroglyphic notation that could record not just the movements of sacred dances, but also the precise breathing patterns, emotional states, and consciousness techniques that made those movements spiritually effective. Her archives contain detailed instructions for over 300 different ceremonial dances, each designed for specific purposes, ranging from healing particular illnesses to inducing prophetic visions. But more remarkably, she found ways to encode information about the inner experiences that accompanied these practices, creating written records that could guide future practitioners through the subjective dimensions of advanced spiritual work. The notation system she developed used combinations of traditional hieroglyphs with specialized symbols that had meaning only to initiated priestesses. A single dance sequence might be accompanied by dozens of marginal notes describing the subtle energy sensations that should occur at each stage, the types of visions or insights that typically arose, and warning signs that indicated when a practitioner was pushing too hard or moving too quickly through the process. These encoded texts were stored in secret chambers within the temple complex, accessible only to priestesses who had achieved the highest levels of initiation. The knowledge they contained was considered so powerful and potentially dangerous that elaborate safeguards surrounded their use. No single individual was given access to complete texts without the presence of at least 2 other master practitioners who could provide guidance and intervention if necessary. The training required to read these advanced texts could take decades to complete. Priestesses had to demonstrate not just intellectual understanding of the symbolic systems, but actual mastery of the practices being described. They were tested through elaborate practical examinations that required them to successfully guide others through complex spiritual processes while maintaining perfect awareness of all the subtle factors that could influence the outcome. Tawi, whose personal journal provides our most detailed account of this advanced training, describes spending 7 years learning to decode a single text that dealt with what she calls the dance of the dying and reborn sun. The document contained instructions for a ceremony that was performed only during solar eclipses, when the temporary darkness created optimal conditions for accessing normally hidden dimensions of consciousness. The preparation for this ceremony required months of intensive practice that gradually attuned the practitioner's nervous system to extremely subtle energy phenomena. Tawi writes about learning to feel the electromagnetic changes that preceded eclipses by days or even weeks, developing sensitivity so acute that she could predict astronomical events without reference to conventional calendrical calculations. But the real challenge lay in maintaining stable consciousness during the eclipse ceremony itself. As the moon's shadow began to cover the sun, participants would enter trance states that deepened progressively with the advancing darkness. At the moment of totality, when day became night in the space of minutes, the lead priestess would perform movements that were said to mirror the sun's journey through the underworld, guiding the consciousness of all participants through a symbolic death and rebirth process. Tawi describes the experience as simultaneously terrifying and ecstatic, a complete dissolution of normal identity followed by a reconstruction of consciousness at a higher level of integration. She writes about feeling her awareness expand beyond the boundaries of her individual body to encompass the entire cosmic drama being enacted overhead, experiencing herself as simultaneously the dying sun, the triumphant moon, and the eternal dance that connected all celestial movements. The aftermath of such ceremonies could be profound and long-lasting. Participants often reported fundamental shifts in their understanding of reality that influenced every aspect of their subsequent lives. Some described feeling permanently connected to cosmic rhythms that had previously been invisible to them. Others claimed to have gained access to knowledge about future events that proved remarkably accurate over time. But perhaps most significantly, these eclipse ceremonies seemed to create lasting bonds between participants that transcended ordinary human relationships. Tawi writes about feeling permanently connected to the other priestesses who had shared the experience with her as though they had become part of her, of a collective consciousness that could function as a unified entity when circumstances required it. These group consciousness phenomena weren't limited to special ceremonial occasions. The daily life of temple communities was structured in ways that encouraged the development of what modern psychologists might call transpersonal awareness. Priestesses lived, worked, and practiced together in patterns that gradually dissolved the rigid boundaries between individual identities, while still maintaining the unique contributions that each person could make to the collective enterprise. Henut Sen, the temple community who spent 30 years at Edfu, describes this process as learning to think with multiple minds simultaneously. She could access not just her own knowledge and experience, but also draw upon the accumulated wisdom of her sisters, creating a form of collective intelligence that far exceeded what any individual could achieve alone. This wasn't achieved through any mystical merging of consciousness, but rather through extremely practical techniques for synchronized breathing, movement, and attention that gradually aligned the nervous systems of participants. When groups of priestesses worked together using these methods, they could solve complex problems, make accurate predictions about future events, and perform healing interventions that seemed to exceed the capabilities of the individuals involved. The therapeutic applications of these group consciousness techniques were particularly remarkable. Teams of priestesses working together could apparently address psychological and spiritual problems that had proven resistant to individual treatment. They would surround a patient with synchronized movements and vocalizations that created what they described as fields of healing energy, capable of penetrating the deepest layers of consciousness. Nefertiti Hotep, whose case studies are preserved in medical papyri from the temple at Kom Ombo, specialized in treating what she called wounds of the soul, psychological trauma that had become so deeply embedded in a person's consciousness that conventional healing methods couldn't reach it. Her approach involved creating therapeutic environments where groups of priestesses would dance around the patient in patterns designed to gradually dissolve the energetic structures that maintained traumatic memories. One particularly detailed case involves a young woman named Kaimwaset, who had witnessed the destruction of her village during a Nubian raid. The experience had left her unable to speak or respond to normal human contact, trapped in a state of psychological shock that traditional healers couldn't penetrate. When she was brought to Nefertiti Hotep's temple, she had been in this condition for over 2 years. The healing process began with simple exposure to the temple environment, allowing Kaimwaset to gradually become accustomed to the rhythmic sounds and movements that filled the sacred space. For weeks, she remained completely unresponsive, but the priestesses continued their daily practices around her, creating a constant background of harmonious energy that slowly began to penetrate her defensive isolation. The breakthrough came during a dawn ceremony when the priestesses were performing what they called the Dance of New Beginnings. As the first rays of sunlight entered the temple courtyard, Khayemwaset suddenly began to weep, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to release months of suppressed emotion. From that moment, she began to respond to the therapeutic interventions, gradually recovering her ability to speak and interact with others. But the healing went far deeper than simple symptom relief. Nefertiti Hotep writes that Khayemwaset emerged from the process with expanded sensitivity and spiritual awareness that hadn't existed before her trauma. She could sense the emotional states of others with remarkable accuracy and showed natural talent for the healing arts that eventually led to her joining the temple community as a priestess in training. Cases like this convinced the priestesses that psychological trauma, while undeniably painful, could also serve as a catalyst for spiritual development if properly understood and treated. They developed sophisticated theories about how extreme experiences could break down the normal structures of consciousness, creating opportunities for reconstruction at higher levels of integration and awareness. These insights led to the development of what they called intentional crisis ceremonies, carefully controlled situations designed to induce profound psychological and spiritual breakthroughs in individuals who were ready for advanced initiation. Unlike the accidental traumas that life sometimes provided, these ceremonial crises were surrounded by extensive support systems and guided by practitioners who understood exactly how to help participants navigate the dissolution and reconstruction of their identity. Merit Ptah, who served as a master of these advanced initiation techniques at the Temple of Philae, left detailed descriptions of how such ceremonies were conducted. The process typically began with months of preparation that gradually strengthened the candidate's psychological foundation and spiritual understanding. Only when extensive testing confirmed their readiness would they be invited to participate in the actual crisis ceremony. The ceremony itself involved a carefully orchestrated sequence of physical, emotional, and spiritual challenges designed to push the participant beyond the normal limits of their identity and consciousness. They might be required to fast for extended periods while performing demanding physical exercises, to confront their deepest fears in ritualized enactments of death and judgment, or to maintain perfect awareness while experiencing states of consciousness that normally occurred only in dreams or delirium. Throughout this process, teams of experienced priestesses would monitor the participants' condition using techniques that allowed them to assess not just physical symptoms, but subtle changes in energy, awareness, and spiritual development. They knew exactly when to intensify the challenges and when to provide support, how to maintain the delicate balance between breakthrough and breakdown that determined whether the experience would prove transformative or traumatic. Merit Ptah describes one particularly intense ceremony involving a young priestess named Nefret Kau, who had reached a plateau in her spiritual development that conventional training methods couldn't penetrate. The crisis ceremony lasted for 7 days and nights, during which Nefret Kau was guided through a symbolic journey that recapitulated the entire process of cosmic creation and dissolution. By the 3rd day, she had entered states of consciousness so profound that she appeared to be unconscious, her body moving through complex dance sequences, while her awareness traveled through what she later described as multiple dimensions of reality. She encountered divine beings who challenged her understanding of her own nature, experienced visions of future events that proved remarkably accurate, and gained insights into the fundamental structure of consciousness that influenced her teaching for the rest of her life. The transformation was so complete that other priestesses initially had difficulty recognizing her personality when she finally returned to normal consciousness. She had retained all her memories and basic character traits, but her entire way of being in the world had shifted to a level of integration and wisdom that typically required decades of gradual development to achieve. These intensive initiation experiences weren't undertaken lightly or frequently. The priestesses understood that such profound alterations of consciousness could be dangerous if attempted without adequate preparation or support. They developed elaborate screening procedures to identify candidates who possessed the psychological stability and spiritual maturity required for successful completion of the process. The criteria they used went far beyond conventional measures of intelligence or talent. They looked for individuals who had demonstrated consistent ethical behavior under pressure, who showed natural compassion for others' suffering, and who possessed what they called the courage to dissolve, the willingness to surrender familiar identity structures in service of deeper truth. Candidates who met these criteria underwent extensive preparation that could last for years. They studied advanced texts, dealing with the nature of consciousness and reality, practiced meditation and visualization techniques that strengthened their capacity for sustained awareness, and participated in progressively more challenging ceremonies that gradually expanded their comfort with non-ordinary states of consciousness. The actual selection for intensive initiation often came through dreams or visions that were interpreted by master priestesses as signs of divine calling. Nefret Kau, whose transformation we just described, reported a recurring dream in which Hathor herself appeared and instructed her to seek the ultimate mysteries of the goddess's teachings. When she shared this dream with Merit Ptah, it was recognized as an authentic spiritual summons that couldn't be ignored. The economic and social implications of maintaining these advanced training programs were substantial. Temples had to support not just the immediate practitioners, but also the extensive infrastructure required for their work. This included specialized buildings designed for specific types of ceremonies, libraries containing thousands of papyrus scrolls with encoded teachings, and workshops where ritual implements were crafted according to precise specifications that had been refined over centuries. The musical instruments used in temple ceremonies, for example, weren't simply decorative objects, but sophisticated tools designed to produce specific psychological and spiritual effects. The sistrums carried by dancing priestesses were tuned to frequencies that could induce trance states, while the temple drums were sized and positioned to create acoustic patterns that enhanced group consciousness phenomena. Ptah-hotep, who served as master craftsman at the temple workshops in Memphis, left detailed instructions for creating these specialized instruments. His texts reveal that even seemingly simple objects, or bells, were designed according like rat to complex mathematical principles that related their physical dimensions to astronomical cycles and energy patterns within the human body. The creation of a single sistrum could require months of work, beginning with the selection of metals that had been mined during specific lunar phases, and continuing through elaborate blessing ceremonies that imbued the finished instrument with what the craftsman called spiritual potency. Only instruments that had undergone this complete process were considered suitable for use in advanced ceremonies. The temples also maintained extensive gardens where they cultivated plants used in healing and consciousness-altering preparations. These weren't simply medicinal herbs-y varieties, but specialized that had been bred over generations to enhance their psychoactive properties. The gardening techniques involved not just botanical knowledge, but understanding of how different growing conditions could influence the spiritual qualities of the plants being cultivated. Nefret-Sob gardener at the Temple of Komek, who served as chief ombo, developed methods for timing planting and harvesting according to astronomical events that maximized the potency of medicinal preparations. She understood that plants absorb different types of cosmic energy depending on the positions of stars and planets during critical growth phases. And she used this knowledge to create preparations that could facilitate specific types of spiritual experience. Her garden included varieties of blue lotus that had been selected for their ability to induce prophetic dreams, frankincense trees whose resin could enhance meditation practices, and numerous other plants whose psychoactive properties were precisely calibrated for different therapeutic and spiritual purposes. The knowledge required to maintain these gardens was passed down through generations of temple gardeners, who guarded their secrets as carefully as the priestesses protected their ceremonial teachings. The preparation and use of these plant medicines was surrounded by elaborate protocols that ensured their safety and effectiveness. Priestesses who specialized in this work underwent training that combined botanical knowledge with deep understanding of consciousness and healing, learning to assess not just the chemical properties of different preparations, but their spiritual and energetic effects on human awareness. Hanut Nefert, whose pharmaceutical papyri represent the most complete ancient manual of consciousness-altering plant medicines, describes preparations that could induce everything from mild relaxation to profound mystical experiences. Her formulations took into account not just the active compounds in various plants, but also factors like the patient's spiritual development, psychological condition, and astrological influences that might affect their response to treatment. One particularly sophisticated preparation involved a combination of blue lotus, honey, and wine that had been fermented using specific types of yeast cultured in temple laboratories. The resulting mixture could apparently facilitate experiences of consciousness, expansion that lasted for several hours while maintaining perfect clarity and control. Henut Nefer describes using this preparation to help normally unconscious advanced students access levels of awareness, where they could observe the subtle processes that governed their own mental and emotional functioning. The ethical frameworks that governed the use of these powerful substances were as sophisticated as the preparations themselves. The priestesses understood that consciousness-altering experiences could be either healing or harmful, depending on the context in which they occurred and the intentions of those involved. They developed elaborate codes of conduct that ensured these tools were used only for legitimate spiritual and therapeutic purposes. Candidates for plant medicine treatments underwent extensive screening that evaluated not just their physical health, but their psychological stability, spiritual maturity, and genuine motivation for seeking expanded consciousness. Those who passed this screening participated in preparatory ceremonies that established the proper mindset and intentions for beneficial outcomes. The actual administration of plant medicines took place in carefully controlled environments where experienced guides could monitor participants and intervene if problems arose. These weren't casual or recreational experiences, but serious spiritual practices that required the same level of preparation and respect as major surgical procedures. Ankef and Sekhmet, who specialized in guiding others through plant medicine journeys, describes the process as a form of temporary death and rebirth that could fundamentally transform a person's understanding of their own nature and place in the universe. She writes about participants who emerged from these experiences with expanded empathy, enhanced creativity, and profound insights into the interconnected nature of all existence. But she also acknowledges the risks involved, describing cases where individuals who weren't properly prepared experienced psychological difficulties that required extensive therapeutic intervention. These negative outcomes reinforce the importance of the screening and preparation procedures that surrounded the use of consciousness-altering substances in temple settings. The integration of plant medicine experiences into ongoing spiritual practice was considered as important as the experiences themselves. Participants worked with counselor priestesses who helped them understand and apply the insights gained during their journeys, ensuring that temporary expansions of consciousness translated into lasting improvements in their daily lives. This integration process often involved artistic expression, with participants creating paintings, sculptures, or musical compositions that captured aspects of their experiences that couldn't be adequately conveyed through words alone. The temple workshops became centers of artistic innovation, where visionary experiences found expression in forms that could inspire and instruct future generations of practitioners. The influence of these visionary arts extended throughout Egyptian culture, shaping everything from architectural design to religious iconography. The distinctive style of Egyptian art, with its emphasis on symbolic representation and multiple perspective, may have been directly influenced by the consciousness states that temple practitioners regularly accessed through their spiritual practices. Khenti Kanaith, who served as chief artist at the Temple of Dendera, created wall paintings that seemed to capture the visual experiences reported by priestesses during their most profound spiritual journeys. Her work featured swirling patterns of energy, geometric forms that appeared to move and shift when viewed from different angles, and human figures that seemed to glow with inner light. These weren't simply decorative elements, but teaching tools designed to help viewers access similar states of consciousness through contemplation of the visual forms. Khenti Kanaith understood that certain combinations of color, shape, and proportion could induce trance states that facilitated spiritual insight and healing, and she used this knowledge to create environments that supported the temple's therapeutic and educational mission. The mathematical principles underlying her artistic designs were based on the same sacred geometry that informed temple architecture and ceremonial choreography. Every element was precisely calculated to create specific psychological and spiritual effects, from the proportions of human figures that encouraged identification with divine archetypes, to the color combinations that enhanced different types of consciousness exploration. Visitors to these temple complexes often reported feeling transported into otherworldly realms simply by walking through spaces where every detail had been designed to facilitate expanded awareness. The combination of architecture, artwork, music, and movement created total environments that could reliably induce profound alterations of consciousness without the need for plant medicines or other external aids. These environmental approaches to consciousness transformation represented perhaps the most sophisticated achievement of ancient Egyptian spiritual technology. The priestesses understood that human awareness was constantly shaped by subtle environmental influences, and they used this knowledge to create spaces that naturally facilitated the types of consciousness states at the temple they wished to cultivate complex at Dendera, which served as the primary center for Hathor worship during the Ptolemaic period, provides the most complete example of how these environmental designs functioned. Every aspect of the complex, from the alignment of buildings with celestial bodies to the acoustic properties of individual chambers, was calculated to support specific types of spiritual practice and consciousness exploration. Walking through this complex today, even in its damaged and incomplete state, visitors often report experiencing unusual states of consciousness that seem to arise spontaneously from the environment itself. The ancient builders understood principles of sacred architecture that modern science is only beginning to rediscover, creating structures that could reliably facilitate transcendent experiences for those who approach them with proper preparation and intention. The dancing priestesses of Hathor were the living embodiments of these architectural principles. Human beings who had learned to transform themselves into temples of consciousness that could facilitate similar experiences in others. Through their movements, their presence, and their understanding of the subtle forces that influenced human awareness, they created mobile sanctuaries that could bring the transformative power of the temples into any environment where their services were needed. Their influence extended far beyond the boundaries of Egypt itself, as foreign visitors who encountered their practices carried knowledge of these techniques back to their own cultures. Greek philosophers, Roman administrators, and traders from throughout the ancient world reported experiencing consciousness states during Egyptian temple ceremonies that challenged their fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and human potential. Some of these foreign visitors became long-term students of the Egyptian mysteries, spending years in temple communities, learning the languages, practices, and theoretical frameworks that supported these writings. Fragment remarkable achievements in consciousness development. Varied though they are, provide valuable external perspectives on the sophistication and effectiveness of the systems the dancing priestesses had developed. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, a Roman official who spent 3 years studying at the Temple of Philae during the late Ptolemaic period, wrote extensively about his experiences with, he called, the divine art of what's sacred movement. His letters, discovered in a sealed jar near Alexandria, describe learning dance techniques that could induce states of consciousness he had never imagined possible. He writes about experiencing direct perception of what the Egyptians called the web of connection that linked all living beings, a state of awareness in which the boundaries between individual consciousness seemed to dissolve completely. During these experiences, he could apparently access information about distant events, communicate with individuals who were physically absent, and gain insights into complex problems that had previously seemed unsolvable. But perhaps most remarkably, Marcus Aurelius describes learning to maintain these expanded states of consciousness while carrying out normal administrative duties, bringing enhanced wisdom and compassion to his work as a government official. The training he received at Philae hadn't just provided him with extraordinary experiences, but had fundamentally transformed his capacity to serve others and contribute positively to the world around him. His account provides valuable insight into how the Egyptian mysteries were transmitted to foreign students and adapted to different cultural contexts. The priestesses were skilled at translating their teachings into frameworks that could be understood and applied by individuals from very different backgrounds, while still maintaining the essential principles that made these practices effective. This adaptability helps explain how elements of Egyptian spiritual technology eventually found their way into Greek philosophy, Roman religious practices, and early Christian mysticism. The dancing priestesses of Hathor weren't just preserving ancient traditions, but actively developing and refining techniques for consciousness transformation that would influence human civilization for millennia to come. The legacy of their work extends into the present day, As modern researchers in psychology, neuroscience, and consciousness studies rediscover principles that these ancient practitioners had mastered thousands of years ago. Their understanding of how movement, sound, and environment could be used to facilitate healing and spiritual development represents a sophisticated body of knowledge that contemporary science is only beginning to appreciate and validate. But Priestesses of Hathor embow beyond their technical achievements. The dancing died an approach to human existence that integrated physical pleasure, emotional fulfillment, intellectual understanding, and spiritual transcendence into a unified way of life. They demonstrated that these different aspects of human experience didn't have to be compartmentalized or set in opposition to each other, but could be woven together into patterns of extraordinary beauty and effectiveness. Their temples were places where the sacred and the sensual danced together in perfect harmony, where the pursuit wisdom enhanced of divine rather than diminished the capacity for earthly joy, and where individual transformation served the greater good of the entire community. In a world that often seems divided between materialistic pursuits and spiritual aspirations, the example of these remarkable women offers a vision of integration and wholeness that remains as relevant today as it was in the time of the pharaohs. The secrets held within the temple walls of ancient Egypt weren't limited to the grand ceremonies and public festivals that drew crowds from across the known world. Some of the most profound mysteries unfolded in the private chambers, where individual priestesses worked with clients who sought healing for ailments that conventional medicine couldn't touch. These intimate sessions revealed the true depth of what these remarkable women understood about the human soul and its capacity for transformation. Senebtika arrived at the temple of Dendera on a morning when the desert winds carried the scent of distant storms. She had traveled for weeks from her home in Upper Egypt, driven by a desperation that had consumed her life for nearly 2 years. Her husband had died suddenly, leaving her not just widowed but somehow unable to feel anything at all. The grief she expected never came. Instead, a terrible numbness had settled over her, as though some essential part of her being had died alongside her beloved. The priestess who received her was Nefret Amentet, a woman whose eyes seemed to hold the wisdom of countless lifetimes. She listened to Senebtika's story without interruption, her trained senses reading far more than the words being spoken. She could see the way grief had crystallized in the woman's body, creating energetic blockages that prevented the natural flow of emotion and life force. What followed wasn't a single dramatic ceremony, but a patient process that unfolded over many months. Nefret Amentet began by teaching Senebtika simple movements that gradually awakened her body's memory of joy. These weren't complex ritual dances, but gentle exercises that helped reconnect her physical form with the emotional currents that had been frozen by trauma. Day after day, Senebtika would join small groups of women who moved together in the temple courtyards, their bodies slowly remembering how to feel. The process was often painful, as locked-away emotions began to surface and demand expression. There were days when she wept uncontrollably, finally releasing the grief that had been trapped within her. There were others when rage erupted, anger at the gods who had taken her husband, at life itself for its cruelty and unpredictability. But Nefret Amentet guided her through each storm of feeling with the skill of a master navigator. She understood that healing required not just the release of blocked emotions, but their integration into a larger pattern of wholeness. Through carefully chosen movements and breathing techniques, she taught Senebtika how to honor her grief while still remaining open to the possibility of future joy. The breakthrough came during the Festival of the Rising Waters, when the annual Nile flood began its life-giving journey across the land. As Senebtika participated in the community dances that celebrated renewal and rebirth, she felt something long dormant stirring within her chest. For the first time since her husband's death, she experienced a genuine moment of happiness, brief but unmistakable. From that point forward, her healing accelerated dramatically. The movements that had once felt mechanical and forced began to flow naturally, as though her body was remembering skills it had possessed long before this lifetime. She discovered that dance could be a form of prayer more powerful than any words, a way of communicating directly with forces that governed life and death, separation and reunion. By the time Syneptica finally returned to her village, she had been transformed into something far more than a healed widow. She had become a conduit for the same healing energies that had restored her own capacity for feeling. Neighbors who had known her for years barely recognized the radiant woman who moved with the fluid grace of the temple dancers, her presence somehow brightening every space she entered. But her story represents just one thread in the vast tapestry of healing work that occupied the daily lives of Hathor's priestesses. Each woman who sought their assistance brought unique challenges that required individually crafted approaches to treatment and transformation. The priestesses understood that no two souls were identical, that healing was an art form requiring creativity, intuition, and deep understanding of human nature in all its complexity. Kayemwaset faced a different kind of suffering when she arrived at the temple of Komombo. A successful merchant's wife from Memphis, she had everything that society considered necessary for happiness: wealth, status, healthy children, and a husband who treated her with respect and affection. Yet she felt utterly empty inside, as though she were living someone else's life while her true self remained buried beneath layers of social expectations and obligations. The priestess, Henut Sened, recognized immediately what was troubling this successful but miserable woman. She had encountered many similar cases, people whose souls had become disconnected from their authentic purpose in life. These weren't medical conditions that could be treated with herbs or potions, but spiritual ailments that required fundamental shifts in consciousness and identity. The treatment began with what Henut Sened called the dance of unmasking. Over many sessions, she guided Kayemwaset through movements designed to strip away the false personas that society had encouraged her to adopt. Each gesture represented the removal of another layer of pretense, another expectation that had nothing to do with her genuine nature and desires. The process was frightening as well as liberating. As the familiar masks fell away, Kayemwaset found herself confronting aspects of her personality that she had suppressed for decades. She discovered that beneath her conventional exterior lived a woman with powerful artistic gifts, deep spiritual longings, and a fierce intelligence that had been channeled into managing household affairs when it craved much greater challenges. Henut Sened helped her understand that these suppressed qualities weren't flaws to be eliminated, but treasures to be integrated into a more complete and authentic way of being. Through carefully designed movement sequences, she taught Kayemwaset how to embody different aspects of her nature without losing the practical skills that had made her successful in conventional terms. The transformation took nearly a year to complete, but when Kayemwaset finally returned to Memphis, she brought with her a revolutionary approach to living that influenced everyone in her household. She established workshops where women could explore artistic expression, created gardens designed according to sacred geometric principles, and began hosting gatherings where philosophical and spiritual questions could be discussed openly. Her merchant husband, initially concerned about these changes, soon discovered that his wife's expanded consciousness had made her an even more valuable partner in their business ventures. Her enhanced intuition and deeper understanding of human nature gave her remarkable skill in negotiations, while her artistic sensibilities helped them develop new products that captured the imagination of their customers. The ripple effects of her transformation extended throughout their community, as other women began seeking the same kind of authentic expression that Kayemwaset had discovered. Without intending to become a teacher, she found herself serving as a bridge between the ancient wisdom of the temples and the practical needs of urban life, demonstrating that spiritual development could enhance rather than conflict with worldly success. These individual success stories were part of a larger pattern that the priestesses had observed over centuries of practice. They understood that healing one person properly could influence entire communities, as transformed individuals naturally became agents of positive change within their social networks. This insight led them to focus their most intensive efforts on people who held positions of influence or who showed particular potential for serving others. Merit Neith exemplified this strategic approach to healing work. Born into a family of minor nobles in Thebes, she had shown exceptional talent for music and dance from an early age. But her gifts were accompanied by a temperament so sensitive that she often became overwhelmed by the emotions and energies of those around her. What should have been advantages had become sources of suffering that threatened to destroy her mental stability. When she was brought to the temple of Karnak at age 16, she was barely functional, unable to spend time in crowds or participate in normal social activities. The intensity of her perceptual abilities made ordinary life feel like a constant assault on her nervous system. Lesser healers had attempted to help her by dulling her sensitivity, but this approach had only created new problems without addressing the root causes of her distress. The master priestess Ankhtawi recognized immediately that Merit Neith's apparent weakness was actually a form of spiritual gift that needed proper training rather than suppression. Her extreme sensitivity meant that she could perceive subtle energies and emotional currents that most people couldn't detect, abilities that could be invaluable for healing work if she learned to manage them properly. The training process began with teaching Merit Neith how to protect herself energetically while still maintaining access to her extraordinary perceptual gifts. Through specific movement patterns and breathing techniques, she learned to create what Ankhtawi called boundaries of light that filtered overwhelming stimuli, while allowing beneficial influences to reach her consciousness. As her defensive skills developed, Merit Neith began to discover the positive applications of her heightened sensitivity. She could sense the onset of illness days before physical symptoms appeared, detect emotional disturbances that others missed entirely, and perceive the subtle energy patterns that revealed a person's deepest spiritual needs and potentials. Under Ankhtawi's guidance, she learned to use these abilities in service of others rather than as sources of personal torment. Her extreme empathy, which had once made social interaction painful, became a powerful tool for understanding and healing the suffering of those who sought temple assistance. Her musical gifts, enhanced by her ability to perceive the energetic effects of different sounds, allowed her to create therapeutic compositions that could facilitate profound shifts in consciousness. Over time, Merit Neith evolved into one of the most accomplished healing priestesses of her generation, sought out by people from across Egypt for treatment of conditions that conventional medicine couldn't address. But more importantly, for the temple community, she became a master teacher who could train others with similar sensitivities, helping them transform what society often viewed as weaknesses into sources of spiritual power and service. Her teaching methods revolutionized the way temples approached the training of especially gifted individuals. Rather than trying to force everyone into the same mold, she developed individualized programs that honored each student's unique combination of abilities and challenges. This personalized approach produced a generation of priestesses whose diverse talents complemented each other perfectly, creating temple communities that could address virtually any type of human suffering or spiritual need. The success of Merit Neith's innovations spread throughout the temple network, influencing training methods at sacred sites across Egypt. Her writings on the education of sensitive individuals became required reading for master teachers, while her therapeutic techniques were adapted for use in healing centers from Alexandria to Aswan. But perhaps her most significant contribution lay in demonstrating that what society often dismissed as abnormality or weakness could actually represent the early stages of extraordinary spiritual development. Her example inspired countless individuals who had felt isolated by their unusual perceptual abilities, showing them pathways for transforming their differences into gifts that could serve the greater good. This understanding of human potential extended beyond individual healing work to encompass the priestesses' role as social innovators and cultural leaders. They recognized that Egyptian civilization's long-term health depended not just on maintaining traditional practices, but on adapting ancient wisdom to meet new challenges and opportunities. Nefret Sobek embodied this forward-thinking approach during the tumultuous period when foreign influences began reshaping Egyptian culture. As Greek merchants and Roman administrators established themselves along the Nile, traditional ways of life came under pressure from new ideas about everything from commerce to philosophy. Many Egyptians felt torn between preserving their ancestral heritage and embracing innovations that might improve their material circumstances. As chief priestess at the Temple of Philae, Nefret Sobek faced the challenge of maintaining the integrity of ancient spiritual practices while remaining relevant to people whose daily lives were increasingly influenced by foreign customs and expectations. Rather than retreating into rigid traditionalism, she chose to engage actively with the cultural changes occurring around her. She began by studying the philosophical and religious traditions that the foreigners brought with them, not to abandon Egyptian wisdom, but to understand how universal spiritual principles manifested in different cultural forms. Her investigations revealed that beneath surface differences, most authentic spiritual traditions shared common insights about consciousness, healing, and human development. This recognition enabled her to create bridges between Egyptian temple practices and foreign spiritual systems, developing hybrid approaches that preserve the essential power of ancient techniques while making them accessible to people from diverse cultural backgrounds. Greek visitors to her temple found meditation practices that complemented their philosophical studies, while Roman officials discovered leadership training that enhanced their administrative effectiveness. But Nefret Sobek's innovations went beyond simple cultural accommodation. She used the encounter with foreign ideas as an opportunity to examine Egyptian practices with fresh eyes, identifying aspects of temple training that could be refined or expanded to meet contemporary needs. Her experiments led to breakthroughs in healing techniques, consciousness development methods, and community organization that enriched the tradition rather than diluting it. Her temple became a center of creative synthesis, where the best insights from multiple cultures combined to produce approaches to human development that were more comprehensive and effective than any single tradition could offer. Students came from throughout the Mediterranean world to participate in training programs that integrated Egyptian movement arts with Greek philosophical inquiry, Roman organizational skills, and wisdom traditions from even more distant lands. The success of these experimental programs demonstrated that authentic spiritual traditions possessed the flexibility to evolve and adapt while maintaining their essential character. Rather than being threatened by cultural diversity, Egyptian temple practices could be strengthened through thoughtful engagement with alternative approaches to consciousness and healing. Nefret Sobek's example inspired similar innovations at temples throughout Egypt, creating a renaissance of spiritual creativity that produced some of the most sophisticated consciousness development techniques in human history. These hybrid approaches combined the depth of ancient wisdom with the precision of contemporary knowledge, resulting in methods for healing and transformation that surpassed anything previously achieved. The international reputation of Egyptian temples during this period attracted not just individual students, but entire delegations of scholars and spiritual seekers from distant lands. These cultural exchanges enriched all participants, as foreign visitors shared their knowledge while absorbing Egyptian insights that they carried back to their home countries. One particularly significant delegation arrived from the mysterious land of Punt, whose exact location remains debated by modern scholars, but which clearly possessed advanced knowledge of consciousness-altering plants and astronomical observation techniques. The Puntite priestesses who visited Nefret Sobek's temple brought with them preparations made from rare herbs that could facilitate extraordinarily clear and detailed prophetic visions. In exchange, they received training in Egyptian dance and movement techniques that enhanced the effectiveness of their botanical preparations while reducing their potential dangers. The collaboration between Egyptian and Puntite practitioners produced hybrid ceremonies that combined the best aspects of both traditions, creating experiences of consciousness expansion that neither culture could have achieved independently. Henut-Wedju, one of the Egyptian priestesses who participated most actively in this cross-cultural exchange, left detailed accounts of the joint ceremonies that emerged from their collaboration. She describes rituals that began with puntite plant preparations administered according to Egyptian protocols for ensuring safety and maximizing therapeutic benefit. As the consciousness-altering effects took hold, participants would engage in movement sequences that combine traditional Egyptian choreography with puntite techniques for directing attention towards specific types of visionary experience. The results were remarkable even by the standards of accomplished temple practitioners. Participants reported visions of extraordinary clarity and detail that provided accurate information about future events, distant locations, and hidden aspects of natural phenomena. Some experienced direct communication with deceased individuals or divine beings, receiving guidance that proved invaluable for addressing personal and community challenges. But perhaps most significantly, these hybrid ceremonies seem to produce lasting expansions of consciousness that enhanced participants' abilities long after the immediate effects of the plant preparations had worn off. People who underwent this training reported permanent improvements in their intuitive abilities, healing powers, and capacity for accessing non-ordinary states of awareness through movement alone. The knowledge gained through these intercultural experiments was carefully documented and preserved in temple archives, creating resources that influenced Egyptian spiritual practices for centuries. The techniques developed through puntite collaboration became part of the advanced training curriculum for master priestesses, while modified versions were adapted for use in healing work with ordinary temple clients. The success of these innovations demonstrated the priestesses' remarkable ability to integrate new knowledge without compromising the integrity of their fundamental practices. They understood that authentic spiritual traditions grew stronger through intelligent adaptation rather than rigid adherence to fixed forms, a wisdom that enabled Egyptian temple culture to flourish even as the political and social landscape around it underwent dramatic transformations. This flexibility proved essential as Egypt entered the Ptolemaic period, when Greek rulers established new administrative systems and cultural norms that challenged traditional Egyptian ways of life. Many religious institutions struggled to maintain their relevance under foreign rule, but the temples of Hathor thrived by demonstrating that their practices could enhance the lives of people from any cultural background. Cleopatra Tryphena, one of the Ptolemaic queens who became a devoted student of Egyptian spiritual practices, provides fascinating insights into how the temple traditions adapted to serve foreign rulers while maintaining their essential character. Her personal letters, written in Greek but filled with Egyptian spiritual terminology, reveal someone who had been profoundly transformed by her encounters with the dancing priestesses of Hathor. She describes learning movement techniques that enhanced her natural charisma and leadership abilities, making her more effective in political negotiations and public appearances. But more importantly, she writes about discovering sources of inner strength and wisdom that enabled her to navigate the complex challenges of ruling a diverse population with competing interests and expectations. The training she received went far beyond personal development to encompass sophisticated understanding of group dynamics and social psychology. The priestesses taught her how to use movement, voice, and presence to influence the emotional states of large audiences, skills that proved invaluable during public ceremonies and political gatherings. But they also emphasized the ethical responsibilities that accompanied such abilities, ensuring that she understood how to use her enhanced influence in service of the greater good, rather than mere personal advantage. The consciousness development techniques she learned were always embedded within moral frameworks that encouraged compassion, wisdom, and dedication to the welfare of all people under her rule. This integration of spiritual practice with political leadership represented one of the most sophisticated achievements of the Egyptian temple system. The priestesses understood that individual transformation was meaningless unless it contributed to the healing and elevation of society as a whole, a perspective that led them to take active roles in training the leaders who would shape their civilization's future. The influence of temple-trained leaders extended throughout Egyptian society, creating a culture where spiritual wisdom informed practical decision-making at every level. Government officials who had studied with the priestesses brought enhanced empathy and intuition to their administrative work, while merchants and craftsmen applied consciousness development techniques to improve their professional skills and ethical standards. This widespread integration of spiritual practice with daily life created a society that was remarkably stable and prosperous, despite the political upheavals that characterized the later periods of Egyptian history. Even as foreign powers competed for control of the Nile Valley, the underlying culture remained coherent and vital, sustained by the network of individuals who had been transformed through contact with temple wisdom. The priestesses understood that their ultimate purpose wasn't simply to preserve ancient traditions, but to ensure that those traditions continued to serve human flourishing under changing circumstances. They saw themselves as gardeners of consciousness, cultivating the seeds of wisdom that could grow and adapt to whatever conditions the future might bring. This long-term perspective enabled them to make strategic decisions about which aspects of their knowledge to emphasize, which techniques to modify, and how to train successors who could carry their work forward into uncertain times. They developed comprehensive archives that preserved not just the forms of their practices, but the principles underlying those forms, ensuring that future generations would possess the understanding needed to recreate effective spiritual technologies, even if specific techniques were lost. Ankh-Ibn Sekhmet, who served as chief archivist during the final centuries of independent Egyptian rule, created documentation systems that would influence knowledge preservation methods for millennia. Her techniques for encoding complex information in multiple formats ensured that essential wisdom could survive even catastrophic disruptions to normal transmission processes. She understood that the greatest threat to spiritual knowledge wasn't external persecution but internal decay, the gradual loss of understanding that occurred when practices became routine rather than living expressions of consciousness development. Her archival methods were designed to preserve not just information, but the inspiration and insight that made that information transformative. The documents she created included not just technical instructions for ceremonies and healing techniques, but detailed accounts of the consciousness, states that made those techniques effective. Future practitioners reading her archives would encounter not just descriptions of what to do, but guidance for accessing the levels of awareness that enabled authentic spiritual work. Her foresight proved remarkably prescient as political changes eventually disrupted the traditional temple system that had sustained Egyptian spiritual culture for thousands of years. But the knowledge she had so carefully preserved found new expressions in the mystery schools, philosophical academies, and healing centers that emerged throughout the Hellenistic world. The dancing priestesses of Hathor had planted seeds of wisdom that would continue germinating long after their original institutional forms had vanished, demonstrating the ultimate success of their approach to consciousness development and cultural preservation. They had created not just a tradition, but a living stream of knowledge that could adapt to serve human needs across cultures and centuries. Their understanding of consciousness as the fundamental reality underlying all existence, their techniques for using movement and sound to facilitate healing and transformation, and their integration of individual development with service to others represented achievements that continue to inspire seekers and healers in our contemporary world. The temple complexes where they once danced may now lie in ruins, but the principles they embodied remain as relevant today as they were in the time of the pharaohs. Their example offers hope that human beings can transcend the limitations of ordinary consciousness, that physical pleasure and spiritual wisdom can be integrated rather than opposed, and that individual transformation can contribute to the healing and elevation of our entire species. As we face the challenges of our own era, the dancing priestesses of Hathor remind us that true wisdom emerges not from avoiding the complexities of human existence, but from embracing them with courage, compassion, and an unshakable faith in the transformative power of consciousness itself. Their legacy lives on in every movement that honors the sacred, every healing that restores wholeness, and every moment when human beings remember their divine potential. The sacred chambers where Nefret Kayemwaset conducted her most advanced healing work contained innovations that pushed the boundaries of what even experienced priestesses considered possible. Unlike the communal ceremonies that drew crowds of participants, these intimate sessions involved techniques so subtle and powerful that they required years of preparation to master safely. Her specialty involved working with individuals who suffered from what she called soul fragmentation, conditions where traumatic experiences had caused essential aspects of personality to become separated from conscious awareness. These weren't simple cases of forgotten memories, but profound splits in the psyche that left people feeling incomplete, unable to access important parts of themselves even when their external circumstances seemed favorable. The healing process began with elaborate diagnostic procedures that could take weeks to complete. Nefret Kayemwaset would observe her clients in various states of consciousness, studying how they moved, breathed, and responded to different types of stimuli. She could detect the energetic signatures of missing soul fragments by noting subtle disruptions in their natural rhythms and flow patterns. Once she had identified the nature and location of the fragmented aspects, she would design individualized movement sequences intended to call those separated parts back into conscious integration. These weren't generic dances, but precisely crafted choreographies that told the story of each person's unique journey through trauma toward healing and wholeness. Amenhotep Sanaith, a young scribe whose case provides our most detailed example of this work, had lost the capacity for joy following a childhood experience so traumatic that he could no longer remember its specific details. He functioned adequately in his professional duties, but lived in a state of emotional numbness that made life feel meaningless and hollow. Nefret Kayemwaset's diagnosis revealed that his capacity for spontaneous happiness had become separated from his conscious personality and was existing as an autonomous fragment in what she called the shadow realm, a dimension of consciousness where disowned aspects of the psyche continued to exist independently. The healing process would require creating conditions where this fragment could safely return and reintegrate with his primary personality. The work began with movements designed to strengthen Amenhotep Sanaith's core identity while creating space for the missing aspects to return. These preparatory dances helped him develop the psychological stability needed to handle the intense emotions that would emerge when the fragmented parts of himself began coming back online. As his capacity to contain difficult feelings increased, Nefret Kayemwaset introduced more complex choreographies that specifically called to his exiled capacity for joy. These weren't celebrations, itations, movements, or expressions of happiness, but invi that created energetic pathways through which the separated aspects could find their way home. The breakthrough came during the 7th month of treatment, when Amenhotep Sanaith spontaneously began weeping during what should have been a routine movement session. But these weren't tears of sadness, they were expressions of overwhelming relief as he felt essential parts of himself returning after years of absence. The integration process continued for several more months, as he learned to incorporate his restored emotional range into daily life, without becoming overwhelmed by feelings he had forgotten how to handle. Set guide, Nefret Kayemwad him through this delicate transition with techniques that gradually expanded his comfort zone while maintaining the stability needed for normal functioning. When the treatment was finally complete, Amenhotep Sanaith had been transformed into resembled the Emot, someone who barely an deadened man who had first sought help. His colleagues noticed that his writing had become more creative and expressive, while his friends remarked on a warmth and vitality that seemed to radiate from his presence. But perhaps most significantly, he had developed the ability to help others who suffered from similar conditions. His direct experience of soul retrieval work had given him insights that complemented Nefret Kayemwaset's technical knowledge, leading to innovations in treatment methods that proved beneficial for many subsequent clients. These advanced healing techniques represented the pinnacle of what individual priestesses could accomplish, but they were part of a larger system that recognized consciousness development as a lifelong journey, requiring community support and guidance. The temples provided not just crisis intervention, but ongoing education and spiritual direction that helped people continue growing throughout their entire lives. The educational programs developed for advanced students covered subjects that wouldn't be recognized in formal academic curricula until modern times. These included detailed study of what we might now call transpersonal psychology, sophisticated understanding of group dynamics and social healing, and practical training in consciousness technologies that could facilitate profound personal transformation. Students learned to recognize the signs that indicated when someone was ready for deeper initiation, how to design experiences that would catalyze breakthrough without creating breakdown, and how to provide support during the integration phases that followed intense spiritual experiences. They studied the relationship between individual healing and social change, understanding how personal transformation could ripple outward to influence entire communities. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to embody the principles they taught, becoming living demonstrations of what human consciousness could achieve when properly developed and directed. Their very presence became therapeutic, their movements prayers in motion, their lives testament to the transformative power of spiritual practice integrated with compassionate service. The training required to reach this level of mastery was demanding beyond anything we might associate with religious education today. Students began each day before dawn with practices designed to align their consciousness with cosmic rhythms, spent their mornings studying sacred texts that encoded advanced psychological and spiritual knowledge, and devoted their afternoons to practical work with clients under the supervision of master teachers. Their evenings were filled with artistic and intellectual pursuits that kept their minds flexible and creative, while their nights often included dream work and meditation practices that continued their education in non-ordinary states of consciousness. This total immersion approach produced individuals whose understanding of human potential far exceeded what most cultures had ever achieved. The depth of knowledge required for mastery of these advanced practices can be glimpsed through the personal notebooks of Hathor, a master teacher who spent 40 years training the most gifted students at the Temple of Edfu. Her writings reveal a curriculum that integrated practical healing techniques with theoretical understanding of consciousness that wouldn't be matched by academic psychology for thousands of years. Students learned to perceive and work with what she called the invisible anatomy, energy systems within the human body that influenced physical health, emotional stability, and spiritual development. They studied how different types of trauma created specific disruptions in these energy patterns and developed precise movement techniques for restoring healthy flow and integration. But their education extended far beyond individual healing to encompass what Hathor called the healing of the world soul. Understanding how individual consciousness participated in larger collective patterns that influenced the health and harmony of entire civilizations. They learned to recognize when personal problems reflected broader social imbalances and developed interventions that could address both individual and collective dimensions simultaneously. This systems thinking enabled the priestesses to serve as early warning systems for their communities, detecting emerging social problems before they manifested as obvious crises. Their enhanced sensitivity to energetic patterns allowed them to perceive when communities were moving toward conflict, economic disruption, or cultural breakdown, insights that enabled preventive interventions rather than merely reactive responses. Nefertiti Ankh-Esenamun specialized in this type of social healing work during the turbulent period that preceded the Assyrian invasions. Her ability to perceive collective consciousness patterns enabled her to predict social upheavals months or even years before they occurred, providing valuable intelligence that helped communities prepare for challenging transitions. Her methods involved creating large-scale ceremonial interventions that could influence the emotional and spiritual climate of entire regions. These weren't simple religious festivals, but sophisticated consciousness technologies designed to heal collective trauma, resolve social conflicts, and restore community cohesion during periods of stress and uncertainty. One particularly dramatic example occurred when rising tensions between different ethnic groups threatened to erupt into violence that could have destabilized the entire region. Traditional diplomatic approaches had failed to resolve the underlying grievances, and many observers expected inevitable conflict that would cause immense suffering and destruction. Nefertiti Ankhesenamun proposed an alternative approach that addressed the emotional and spiritual roots of the conflict rather than just its political manifestations. She organized a series of healing ceremonies that brought representatives from all involved groups together in sacred spaces, where their common humanity could be experienced directly rather than merely understood intellectually. The process began with individual healing work that helped participants release the accumulated resentments and fears that fueled their animosity toward other groups. As personal wounds were addressed, space opened for genuine communication and understanding to emerge between former enemies. The climax came during a 7-day festival that combined elements from all the involved cultural traditions, creating a shared experience of beauty and transcendence that reminded participants of their fundamental interconnection despite surface differences. The ceremonies culminated in collaborative dances, where former adversaries moved together in patterns that symbolized their willingness to create harmony rather than perpetuate division. The results exceeded even Nefertiti Ankhesenamun's expectations. Not only were the immediate tensions resolved, but the participating communities developed ongoing relationships based on mutual respect and cooperation that lasted for generations. The healing process had transformed a potential disaster into an opportunity for enhanced unity and collaboration. Word of these successes spread throughout Egypt and beyond, establishing the Priestesses of Hathor as master practitioners of what we might now call conflict resolution and community healing. Delegations arrived from distant regions seeking assistance with their own social problems, while local leaders increasingly consulted temple communities before making decisions that might affect intergroup relations. This expansion of their influence brought new responsibilities and challenges that required further innovations in their methods and training. The priestesses needed to develop approaches that could work across cultural boundaries while remaining true to their fundamental principles of consciousness development and spiritual service. Ankhesenmut emerged as a leading innovator during this period, creating training programs specifically designed for priestesses who would work in multicultural environments. Her curriculum emphasized universal human experiences that transcended cultural differences while still honoring the unique contributions that different traditions could make to healing and transformation. Students in her programs learned to identify the common psychological and spiritual needs that existed across all cultures while developing sensitivity to the particular forms through which different groups expressed and addressed those needs. They studied comparative religion and philosophy not as academic subjects, but as practical tools for creating bridges between diverse communities. Most importantly, they learned to embody a quality of presence that could serve as a unifying force regardless of the specific cultural context in which they found themselves. This involved developing what Ankhesenmut called transparent consciousness, a state of awareness so clear and open that people from any background could see their own highest potential reflected in the priestess's being. Achieving this level of consciousness required years of intensive inner work that stripped away all cultural conditioning and personal preferences that might create barriers to universal compassion and understanding. Students learn to identify and dissolve any tendency toward judgment or favoritism while still maintaining the discernment needed to provide effective guidance and healing. The training process involved extended periods of service in communities very different from their places of origin, where they had to learn to communicate essential spiritual principles through unfamiliar cultural forms and languages. These immersion experiences taught them that authentic wisdom could find expression through any cultural medium when approached with sufficient skill and sensitivity. The results of this advanced training were remarkable. Priestesses who completed Ankes and Muktefnut's program could work effectively with people from vastly different backgrounds, adapting their methods to suit local customs while maintaining the power and integrity of their fundamental approach to healing and transformation. Their success in cross-cultural work established the temples of Hathor as international centers of learning that attracted students from throughout the known world. These foreign students didn't simply absorb Egyptian methods, but contributed their own cultural wisdom to create hybrid approaches that enriched the tradition for everyone involved. The temple complex at Philae became particularly famous for these international programs, developing a reputation that drew seekers from as far away as India and Northern Europe. The diversity of perspectives and techniques available there created an extraordinarily rich environment for consciousness exploration and spiritual development. Students could study traditional Egyptian dance therapy alongside Indian breathing techniques, Roman organizational methods, Greek philosophical inquiry, and mystical practices from cultures whose names have been lost to history. This synthesis of approaches produced some of the most accomplished spiritual practitioners and healers in human history. But the priestesses were careful to ensure that this diversity enhanced rather than diluted the essential power of their work. They developed sophisticated methods for evaluating which foreign techniques were compatible with Egyptian principles and which adaptations could be made without compromising the integrity of consciousness development practices. The criteria they used focused on results rather than cultural preferences, testing whether new approaches actually facilitated the healing and transformation they were designed to produce. Techniques that proved effective were refined and integrated into the standard curriculum, while those that failed to produce consistent benefits were discarded regardless of their theoretical appeal. This empirical approach to spiritual practice was revolutionary for its time and remains remarkable even by contemporary standards. The priestesses understood that authentic spirituality must be grounded in direct experience rather than mere belief or tradition, and they were willing to modify their methods whenever better approaches became available. Their willingness to evolve and adapt enabled the Egyptian temple system to remain vital and effective, even as the cultural environment around it underwent dramatic changes. Rather than becoming fossilized relics of an ancient past, the temples continued developing new approaches to consciousness and healing that addressed contemporary challenges while preserving timeless wisdom. The documentation systems that preserve this ongoing evolution provide extraordinary insights into how authentic spiritual traditions maintain their relevance across historical periods. The priestesses understood that true preservation required continuous renewal, keeping essential principles alive through constant creative application rather than rigid adherence to fixed forms. This dynamic approach to tradition created a legacy that extended far beyond the specific institutional structures that originally supported it. When political changes eventually disrupted the traditional temple system, the knowledge and methods that had been developed found new expressions in mystery schools, therapeutic communities, and consciousness development programs throughout the ancient world. The influence of Egyptian temple practices can be traced through Greek philosophy, Roman healing centers, early Christian mysticism, and numerous other spiritual traditions that emerged in the centuries following Egypt's incorporation into foreign empires. The dancing priestesses of Hathor had created approaches to consciousness development that were too valuable to be lost, ensuring their survival through multiple cultural transformations. Modern researchers studying ancient consciousness technologies continue to discover techniques developed by these remarkable women, finding practical methods for facilitating healing and transformation that remain effective despite the passage of millennia. Their understanding of how movement, sound, and group dynamics could be used to access expanded states of awareness represents a sophisticated body of knowledge that contemporary science is only beginning to appreciate. But perhaps their greatest achievement lay in demonstrating that human consciousness possessed potentials that most cultures had never imagined possible. Through their own transformations and their success in facilitating similar changes in others, They proved that ordinary people could develop extraordinary abilities when provided with proper training and support. Their temples were laboratories for human potential, where the boundaries between the possible and impossible were constantly being redefined through direct experience and practical application. They showed that healing could be instantaneous, that consciousness could transcend the limitations of individual identity, and that physical existence could serve as a vehicle for spiritual realization rather than an obstacle to it. The sacred marriage ceremonies that represented some of their most profound work demonstrated how human sexuality could be transformed from mere physical pleasure into a pathway for experiencing divine consciousness. These weren't simply fertility rituals, but sophisticated practices that used erotic energy as a doorway to transcendent states of awareness. Couples who participated in these ceremonies reported experiencing themselves as embodiments of cosmic principles rather than simply individual personalities seeking gratification. The physical union became a means for accessing universal patterns of creation and dissolution that governed all existence, transforming intimate relationship into spiritual practice of the highest order. But these advanced practices were always embedded within ethical frameworks that ensured they served the participants' highest development rather than merely satisfying personal desires. The priestesses understood that powerful techniques could be either liberating or destructive depending on the consciousness and intentions of those who employed them. The screening processes that determined who could participate in sacred marriage ceremonies were extraordinarily thorough, evaluating not just the couple's emotional maturity and spiritual development, but their capacity to handle the intense experiences that authentic tantric practice could produce. Only those who demonstrated genuine commitment to consciousness development and mutual service were permitted to engage in these powerful transformational processes. The preparation required could take months or even years, during which couples learned to see their relationship as a vehicle for spiritual growth rather than merely personal fulfillment. They studied the psychological and energetic dynamics that influenced intimate partnership while developing communication skills that enabled them to navigate the challenges that arose during intensive spiritual work together. Most importantly, they learned to approach their sexuality as a sacred gift that could facilitate profound healing and awakening when treated with proper reverence and understanding. This perspective transformed physical intimacy from something that might distract from spiritual development into one of its most powerful catalysts. The ceremonies themselves took place in specially prepared sacred spaces, where every detail had been designed to support transcendent experience. The architecture, acoustics, lighting, and energetic qualities of these chambers had been refined over centuries to create environments that naturally facilitated expanded states of consciousness. Participants entered these spaces after extensive purification rituals that cleansed both body and consciousness, while establishing the sacred intentions that would guide their experience. They were guided by master priestesses who understood exactly how to facilitate the delicate process of using erotic energy for spiritual realization. The actual ceremony involved a carefully orchestrated progression through different levels of consciousness and intimacy, with each stage designed to deepen the participants' connection to both each other and the divine forces that their union was invoking. The physical aspects of the ceremony were always embedded within larger spiritual contexts that gave meaning and direction to every gesture and sensation. Those who successfully completed these sacred marriage ceremonies reported transformations that influenced every aspect of their subsequent lives. Their capacity for love, both for each other and for all beings, was permanently expanded, while their understanding of the sacred dimensions of existence became direct and undeniable. But perhaps most remarkably, these couples often developed abilities that neither possessed individually, as though their union had created possibilities that transcended the sum of their separate potentials. They might gain enhanced intuitive abilities, healing powers, or creative gifts that emerged only when they were working together in harmony. These phenomena convinced the priestesses that human consciousness was far more fluid and interconnected than most people realized. Individual identity, while important for practical purposes, represented only one level of awareness that could be transcended through appropriate practices and relationships. The implications of this understanding extended far beyond intimate relationships to encompass all forms of human connection and collaboration. The priestesses developed group consciousness techniques that enabled communities to function as unified entities while still honoring the unique contributions of individual members. These collective consciousness practices were applied to everything from healing ceremonies that involved hundreds of participants to decision-making processes that could access wisdom beyond what any single person possessed. The results demonstrated that human beings were capable of forms of cooperation and intelligence that most cultures had never attempted to develop. The dancing priestesses of Hathor had discovered that consciousness was not confined within individual brains, but existed as a field that connected all living beings in patterns of extraordinary beauty and complexity. Their practices were designed to help people access this larger awareness while still maintaining the personal identity needed for effective functioning in the physical world. This understanding of consciousness as both individual and universal provided the foundation for all their healing work, educational programs, and social innovations. They knew that helping one person expand their awareness inevitably contributed to the evolution of consciousness in everyone they touched, creating ripple effects that could transform entire communities over time. Their legacy lived on in the most unexpected places, as knowledge that had once flourished in Egyptian temples found new expression through students who carried these teachings far beyond the Nile Valley. The transformation of consciousness that began with dancing priestesses would eventually touch civilizations across the ancient world, though often in forms so adapted to local customs that their Egyptian origins became nearly invisible. In the bustling port city of Rhodes, a former temple student named Alexia Neferre established what appeared to be a simple school for young women. To casual observers, she taught music, dance, and the domestic arts that wealthy families expected their daughters to master. But those who looked more carefully would have noticed something extraordinary in the way her students moved, the quality of presence they developed, and the remarkable healing abilities that seemed to emerge naturally from their education. Alexia Neferret had spent 7 years at the Temple of Dendera, where she had mastered not just the external forms of sacred dance, but the consciousness principles that made those movements spiritually effective. When political changes made it necessary for her to leave Egypt, she faced the challenge of preserving and transmitting this knowledge in a cultural environment that had no framework for understanding what she had learned. Her solution was brilliantly simple. Rather than attempting to recreate Egyptian temple practices in their original form, she embedded the essential principles within activities that Greek society already accepted and valued. Her students learned traditional Greek dances, but these were taught with breathing techniques and awareness practices that gradually developed their sensitivity to subtle energy phenomena. Music lessons became opportunities to explore how different sounds affected consciousness and emotional states. Students discovered that they could use their voices not just for entertainment, but for healing themselves and others, though this application was presented as a natural extension of proper vocal training, rather than as exotic spiritual practice. Even seemingly mundane subjects like household management became vehicles for consciousness development. Alexia Neferret taught her students to approach cooking, cleaning, and organizing as forms of meditation that could cultivate mindfulness and presence. They learned that any activity performed with proper attention could become a spiritual practice that enhanced their awareness and effectiveness. The results spoke for themselves. Alexia Neferet's students were renowned throughout Rhodes for their poise, intelligence, and remarkable ability to create harmony wherever they went. They made exceptional wives and mothers, but they also served as informal counselors and healers within their communities, applying skills they had learned through their seemingly conventional education. Young women who had studied with Alexia Neferret seemed to possess an almost magical ability to diffuse conflicts, comfort the grieving, and inspire others to discover their best qualities. They could enter a room filled with tension and somehow transform the atmosphere simply through their presence and subtle interventions that others barely noticed. But perhaps most remarkably, they passed these abilities on to their own children and communities without ever explicitly describing them as spiritual practices. The consciousness development techniques that had originated in Egyptian temples became part of the cultural fabric of Rhodes, influencing generations of families who never knew the exotic origins of their enhanced wisdom and effectiveness. This pattern repeated itself throughout the ancient world, as former temple students established new lives in distant lands. They became physicians in Rome who achieved remarkable healing results through methods that seemed to involve only conventional treatments. They served as advisors to rulers who found their counsel unusually insightful and effective. They worked as artists, teachers, and merchants whose success seemed to flow from sources that observers couldn't quite identify. In the mountain villages of Anatolia, a woman known only as Hathor established a community that outsiders assumed was simply a collection of families who had chosen to live together for practical reasons. The reality was far more sophisticated. Hathor had recreated essential aspects of Egyptian temple life within the framework of an apparently conventional farming community. The daily routines that governed community life were carefully designed to facilitate consciousness development and spiritual growth. Work assignments rotated according to patterns that ensured everyone received training in different aspects of practical and spiritual skills. Seasonal celebrations combined agricultural necessity with ceremonial practices that maintained the group's connection to cosmic rhythms and divine consciousness. Children growing up in this community received an education that appeared to focus on practical skills like farming, crafts, and trade, but which actually provided comprehensive training in consciousness development, healing arts, and spiritual wisdom. By the time they reached adulthood, they possessed abilities that would have been remarkable in Egyptian temples. Though they understood these capabilities as simply natural human potentials that proper upbringing could develop, some of these young people eventually left the community to establish similar settlements in other regions, gradually creating a network of consciousness-focused communities that stretched across the ancient world. Others remained to deepen their practice and serve as teachers for the next generation, ensuring that the essential knowledge would continue to evolve and adapt to changing circumstances. The success of these hidden communities demonstrated that the principles developed by Egyptian priestesses could flourish in virtually any cultural environment when skillfully adapted to local conditions. The specific forms might change dramatically, but the underlying understanding of consciousness development and spiritual service remained constant across all variations. This adaptability proved crucial as the ancient world underwent the massive politicalations that accompany and cultural transform the rise and fall of successive empires. Traditional religious institutions often struggled to survive these changes, but the consciousness development principles preserved by former temple students proved remarkably resilient. During the chaotic period that followed the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, when established learning centers were being destroyed and traditional knowledge was being lost, these hidden communities served as crucial repositories of wisdom that might otherwise have vanished completely. They preserved not just information, but living practices that continued to produce transformed individuals capable of serving their communities with extraordinary effectiveness. Marcella Hathor exemplified this preservation work during the particularly difficult period when barbarian invasions threatened to destroy all vestiges of classical civilization. Officially, she was simply the abbess of a small Christian convent in rural Gaul, but her background included decades of study in Egyptian mystery schools before political circumstances forced her to adapt her work to Christian frameworks. The convent she established appeared to follow conventional Christian practices, but careful observation would have revealed subtle differences that made it extraordinarily effective as a center for healing and spiritual development. The daily schedule of prayers and services incorporated breathing techniques and movement patterns derived from temple practices, while the manual labor that supported the community was organized according to principles that facilitated consciousness expansion. The nuns who lived under Marcella Hathor's guidance developed reputations throughout the region for their remarkable healing abilities and wisdom. People traveled great distances to seek their counsel and treatment, finding relief from ailments that conventional medicine couldn't address, and guidance that helped them navigate the challenges of living in a world where familiar social structures were collapsing. But perhaps, most importantly, these nuns trained young women who would later establish similar communities throughout Europe, creating a network that preserved and transmitted consciousness development knowledge during one of the darkest periods in Western history. They ensured that wisdom, which had flourished in Egyptian temples, would survive to influence the eventual renaissance of learning that emerged centuries later. The methods they used to embed ancient knowledge within Christian frameworks were masterfully subtle. Meditation practices were presented as forms of contemplative prayer that brought practitioners into closer communion with divine consciousness. Healing techniques were understood as expressions of Christian charity that channeled divine love into practical service. Community organization followed principles that maximized both individual development and collective effectiveness, while appearing to conform to conventional monastic standards. This integration was so skillful that even church authorities who were suspicious of anything that seemed pagan found nothing objectionable in the practices of these communities. The consciousness development techniques had been so thoroughly adapted to Christian language and imagery that they appeared to represent nothing more than particularly effective approaches to traditional spiritual disciplines. Yet the results these communities produced far exceeded what conventional Christian practices typically achieved. The nuns displayed levels of wisdom, compassion, and practical effectiveness that impressed even skeptical observers, while the healing work they conducted often bordered on what others considered miraculous. The success of these adaptations demonstrated that authentic spiritual principles possessed a universal quality that could find expression through any religious or cultural framework when approached with sufficient understanding and skill. The essence of consciousness development transcended the specific symbols and concepts through which it was transmitted, allowing the same fundamental insights to serve human flourishing, regardless of their cultural packaging. This recognition led to even more sophisticated approaches to preserving and transmitting spiritual knowledge across cultural boundaries. Advanced practitioners learned to identify the essential principles underlying different wisdom traditions, discovering common ground that made it possible to create hybrid approaches that drew from multiple sources while remaining coherent and effective. During the Islamic expansion period, when Muslim scholars were actively seeking knowledge from all available sources, former students of Egyptian temples found opportunities to contribute their understanding to the development of Islamic mysticism and healing arts. The Sufi traditions that emerged from this synthesis combined Islamic theology with consciousness, trace development techniques that could back to ancient Egyptian practices. Fatima al-Misraya, whose name literally meant Fatima the Egyptian, played a crucial role in this transmission process. Born into a Coptic Christian family that had secretly preserved Egyptian temple knowledge for generations, she converted to Islam as a young woman, but brought with her a deep understanding of consciousness development principles that enriched her new religious practice. Her approach to Islamic mysticism incorporated movement practices that bore striking resemblances to ancient temple dances, though they were now understood as expressions of devotion to Allah-hacations of Egyptian rather than Invi deities. The breathing techniques and meditation methods she taught her students facilitated direct experience of divine consciousness that transformed their understanding of Islamic spirituality. The Sufi community that formed around her teachings became renowned throughout the Islamic world for the depth of their spiritual realization and their effectiveness as healers and counselors. They attracted students from across the Muslim empire, many of whom later established similar communities in their home regions, gradually creating a network that preserved and developed consciousness exploration techniques within Islamic frameworks. But Fatima al-Misriya's most significant contribution lay in demonstrating that the mystical core of different religious traditions was essentially identical, despite their different theological languages and ritual forms. Her students learned to recognize the same fundamental principles operating within Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and other traditions they encountered, enabling them to serve as bridges between communities that might otherwise have remained isolated from each other. This interfaith understanding proved invaluable during periods of religious conflict, when communities that followed different traditions found themselves in competition or outright warfare. Fatima al-Misriya's students often served as mediators who could help opposing groups recognize their common spiritual ground while respecting their different cultural expressions. The healing work they conducted transcended religious boundaries, as their techniques proved effective regardless of the patient's theological beliefs or cultural background. They understood that consciousness development and healing operated according to universal principles that were independent of religious doctrine, allowing them to serve anyone who sought their assistance with genuine need. These interfaith applications of ancient Egyptian wisdom created some of the most sophisticated approaches to conflict resolution and community healing that the medieval world produced. Practitioners learned to address not just individual suffering, but the collective trauma and social tensions that fueled ongoing conflicts between different groups. One particularly remarkable example occurred during the Crusades, when religious warfare had created seemingly irreconcilable divisions between Christian and Muslim communities throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Traditional diplomatic approaches had failed to resolve the underlying animosities that perpetuated cycles of violence and revenge. A group of practitioners trained in Fatima al-Misriya's methods proposed an alternative approach that addressed the spiritual and emotional roots of the conflict rather than just its political manifestations. They organized healing ceremonies that brought together individuals from both sides who had suffered losses in the ongoing warfare, creating opportunities for shared grief to replace mutual hatred. The process began with separate sessions where participants from each community could express their pain and anger in safe environments surrounded by others who shared their experiences. As the intensity of their emotions was acknowledged and honored, space gradually opened for recognition that their enemies had suffered similar losses and felt comparable pain. The breakthrough came when representatives from both communities participated in joint ceremonies that focused on their common humanity rather than their religious differences. The movements and breathing practices used in these sessions facilitated experiences of expanded consciousness that revealed the artificial nature of the divisions that seem so important in ordinary awareness. Participants reported feeling profound connections with former enemies, recognizing them as fellow human beings who were struggling with the same fundamental challenges of existence that all people faced. The religious and cultural differences that had seemed so significant began to appear as surface variations on universal themes of love, loss, hope, and fear. And these shared recognitions created the foundation for practical agreements that addressed the specific grievances fueling the conflict while establishing frameworks for ongoing cooperation rather than continued warfare. The healing process had transformed a seemingly intractable political problem into an opportunity for enhanced understanding and collaboration. The success of this intervention established consciousness-based approaches to conflict resolution as valuable alternatives to purely political or military solutions. Practitioners trained in these methods became sought-after mediators whose services were requested by rulers throughout the region who faced similar challenges with divided populations. But perhaps more importantly, the techniques developed through this work demonstrated that even the most deeply entrenched conflicts could be resolved when the underlying consciousness that created them was addressed directly. The divisions that seem so real and important in ordinary awareness often proved to be illusions that dissolved when people accessed expanded states of consciousness that revealed their fundamental interconnection. This understanding led to the development of what practitioners called consciousness archaeology, methods for identifying and healing the deep psychological and spiritual wounds that created ongoing patterns of conflict and suffering in communities. These techniques could root while trace contemporary problems back to their historical, providing practical interventions that broke cycles of trauma and revenge. Communities that had been locked in multi-generational conflicts found that consciousness archaeology could reveal the original wounds that had initiated their cycles of mutual harm, while providing healing processes that allowed them to release the past and create new patterns of relationship. The methods proved effective even when the original causes of conflict had been forgotten or distorted through repeated retelling. The practitioners who specialized in this work understood that collective trauma operated according to the same principles as individual psychological wounds, creating energetic imprints that influenced community behavior long after the original events had passed. Healing these collective wounds required techniques that could access and transform the shared consciousness that held traumatic memories in place. The process typically began with careful historical research that identified the specific events and circumstances that had created lasting divisions between groups. But unlike conventional historical investigation, this research focused on understanding the emotional and spiritual impact of past events rather than just their factual details. Practitioners would then design healing ceremonies that allowed communities to process their collective trauma in ways that honored their pain while opening possibilities for forgiveness and reconciliation. These weren't simple rituals of forgiveness, but sophisticated psychological interventions that addressed the deep structures of consciousness that maintained patterns of conflict and separation. The ceremonies themselves often lasted for days or weeks, gradually guiding participants through the complex emotional terrain that surrounded historical wounds. Communities learned to grieve their losses together while releasing the anger and resentment that had kept them trapped in cycles of mutual harm. The most profound transformations occurred when communities could access states of consciousness that revealed the larger patterns of which their specific conflicts were part. From these expanded perspectives, their struggles appeared as expressions of universal human challenges, rather than unique grievances that justified ongoing animosity. These expanded viewpoints didn't minimize the reality of their suffering or excuse the harmful actions that had created their divisions. Instead, they provided larger contexts that made forgiveness and reconciliation possible by revealing the unconscious forces that had driven destructive behavior on all sides. Communities that successfully completed these healing processes often emerged with enhanced capacity for cooperation and mutual support that exceeded what they had possessed before their original conflicts began. The trauma that had once divided them became a source of wisdom that enabled them to help other communities facing similar challenges. This pattern of transformation through shared suffering represented one of the most profound insights that had emerged from the ancient Egyptian understanding of consciousness and healing. The priestesses had recognized that pain and difficulty, when properly understood and processed, could become catalysts for spiritual development that produced greater wisdom and compassion than would have been possible without the original challenges. This recognition led them to develop what they called sacred suffering practices, methods for working with unavoidable difficulties in ways that transform them into opportunities for consciousness expansion and service to others. These weren't masochistic approaches that sought out unnecessary pain, but sophisticated techniques for extracting wisdom and strength from the challenges that life inevitably provided. The applications of sacred suffering practices extended far beyond individual healing to encompass entire communities and cultures that faced difficult transitions or traumatic events. Practitioners learned to help groups process collective challenges in ways that strengthened rather than weakened their capacity for cooperation and mutual support. During the plague outbreaks that periodically devastated ancient communities, practitioners of these techniques served as crucial sources of stability and hope that helped societies maintain their coherence during periods of extreme stress. They understood how to work with the fear, grief and despair that accompanied mass mortality events, while helping communities discover meaning and purpose that transcended their immediate suffering. The healing approaches they developed during these crisis periods often proved more effective than conventional medical treatments, not because they ignored physical reality, but because they addressed the psychological and spiritual dimensions of illness that conventional medicine overlooked. They understood that healing required attention to consciousness as well as body, meaning as well as mechanism. Their success in treating plague victims established them as valued members of medical teams throughout the ancient world, where their contributions complemented rather than competed with conventional treatments. They specialized in addressing the despair and terror that often proved more deadly than the physical symptoms of disease, helping patients maintain the will to live while supporting their body's natural healing processes. So there you have it. The dancing priestesses of Hathor weren't just ancient entertainers or religious functionaries. They were revolutionary healers who understood that the human body, mind and spirit formed an integrated whole that could be transformed through movement, sound and sacred intention. From Kentikar's dawn ritual at Dendra to Nefret Kemwaset's soul retrieval work, from the festival of drunkenness to the secret eclipse ceremonies, these remarkable women developed consciousness technologies that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. Their legacy lives on not just in the ruins of their temples, but in every healing practice that honors the sacred connection between pleasure and transcendence, between individual transformation and collective renewal. The next time you feel the urge to move your body to music or find healing through dance, remember that you're touching something ancient and profound that the priestesses of Hathor knew 3,000 years ago.